With deep connections to nature, the world's indigenous peoples and local communities are experiencing some of the most pronounced effects of climate change. This video documents a United Nations process that is bringing together traditional communities and climate change scientists, especially at two conferences held in Mexico and Australia.
Во-первых, мы посмотрели диалог разных культур.
This series focuses on some of the key links between traditional knowledge and science and the policy solutions being workshopped.
The scientists are beginning to say, there's something we need to know.
As science is based on what? It's based on observation. And the traditional knowledge also, to somehow, is based on observation.
Indigenous peoples have something to contribute in terms of solutions to the problem of climate change.
One of the key areas discussed at the conferences included environmental impacts and community adaptations associated with climate change. Indigenous leader Vicky Tauli Corpaz pointed out that Indigenous knowledge is fine-tuned to local contexts and is essential for climate change adaptation and long-term community resilience.
I think the evidence shows that many of the ecosystems which are still intact are found in indigenous peoples' territories. One possible reason for that is because, of course, the low-carbon lifestyle, or the sustainable lifestyles of indigenous peoples. The other reason is because they use their traditional knowledge to be in sync with nature's processes.
Indigenous peoples live in almost every region of the world. Their territories cover 22% of the world's landmass and contain 80% of the world's biodiversity. One of the ways Indigenous knowledge is working with climate science is by offering observations and interpretations at a very fine localized scale. IPCC Working Group 3 Chair Yuba Sokona explains.
Because we need more and more to have different early warning systems. And in most of the tradition, they have some early warning system on any extreme event that will happen, because they do have some sign, as science is based on what? It's based on observation. And the traditional knowledge also, to somehow, is based on observation.
Human beings have been paying attention to their environment for a long time, and we would do well to pay attention to those who've been paying attention to where we live now for a long time, and that would be the native communities.
By recognizing signs such as wind direction, rainfall, temperature change, celestial movement, animal behavior, and the flowering of plants, many communities organize their lives around seasonal calendars. Varying widely across the world, traditional calendars play an important role in how communities interpret and respond to shifts in climate patterns.
So we use our indicators, the plants and the animals, to monitor the weather, and this is how we work on the land. It is helpful to design our own calendar, which is a great thing to say when it's ready for us to hunt and gather, because there's a space of breeding and there's a space of time out for people and animals.
Participants at the UN conferences shared accounts of some of the impacts of climate change on local communities.
Things that people used to know, used to operate with, used to rely upon, are not working anymore almost everywhere. And that, to me, is probably the strongest confirmation we have of really dramatic changes that are happening in global ecosystems in plural.
Climate change is disrupting subsistence culture, because subsistence cultures depend upon intact habitats, and that's what climate change is disrupting, intact habitats.
Marilyn Wallace from Australia related how habitat changes and a changing climate are transforming relationships within her rainforest homelands.
popo churkin churkiki.
In East Africa, the Maasai peoples are recognizing rainfall regime changes. In the Andes, mountain communities are witnessing water cycle fluctuations.
Mayukuna piskausak poning lapan poning kausak cheka rimeya mana sut itach uyarina terima enas pak uyaringi pun endeningi pun cak taki khena onops kaparing wa nasuk man monai thalme ukunda salme laujet lau tatapon tuka karnal ukutab karnal takitapon tuka Pascua ukutab si bandul nas gitaras kams anji tatuka angwasi ukuchap chi na pasa kunang mana yaringu chi yara kay mandang kuya triste ime no kanjes yara kas purikuns mana haywaris ka anchi nang mayu kunabs chi mi yara kas chi ronata apa chi latag mi mil popong giri rumpikuna yara kas mana yarakting.
In the Pacific, frequent hurricanes and rising king tides are affecting food security and health.
Kapse tenwa matene ni haks mne takarsakap ni haks ke nuwala pitsni pala balili ke haumi hakapatuni na manak hakapakoru yahana managaden trukatun na tem tekato yana man kahite mermernain aves pante kato nalam pege ebtnanon trutasie katopsona naman swamp te kaika none nori I posamanon traman ka ke Roman hita kehlu sapthanap palipine 6 wahastra saitra malaria.
The lead authors are very concerned if this is valid.
Snow change conveyed some of the observations of local and indigenous communities in the Arctic.
The most important message that we wish to present here is the observation and confirmed melting of the permafrost in Siberia, which is leading to an uncontrolled release of millions of tons of new greenhouse gases, which are currently trapped in the Siberian permafrost.
One of the snow change delegates, Siberian reindeer herder Pyotr Korgin, relays some of the changes observed by his people.
Признаков очень много появилось. Лед на реке раньше идет уже временем. Птицы тоже на 1,5 недели стали раньше прилетать.
The permafrost melt is preventing the migrating reindeer herders from reaching the northern Arctic coastline.
Раньше мы кочевали в июле месяце, в середине июля уже были на море. А сейчас до моря не доходим уже, почти километров 150.
Pyotr recounted that near the coastlines, solid ground is turning into swamp, and the warm, humid summers are bringing necrobacillosis, a foot rot disease, to the reindeer herds.
Стараемся не ходить, чтобы пастбище там зараженное, поэтому стараемся через 5-6 лет уже по туда проходить.
On the other side of the Arctic, the Inupiaq people's ancient relationship with the bowhead whale is being affected by the melting sea ice. Cultural researcher Dr. Chia Sakakibara has been working with the Inupiaq people.
Now that the sea surface temperature is rising, the environment is getting too warm for the bowhead whales to survive in the area that's near the coast, which means close to the villages. So Inupiaq whalers now have to go out to the open water 50 miles or 60 miles, which would require them to incorporate technology such as motorized boats, engines, fuels, and many other aspects. And how does this influence human-whale relationship?
Around the world, rapid environmental shifts associated with climate change are challenging cultural identities. At an adaptation meeting in Mexico, Native American scientist and IPCC author Margaret Redsteer explains.
Right. And it's really heartbreaking for a lot of the people who are the ceremonialists on the reservation, and in part because there are so many changes that are occurring that they don't know what to do about. For instance, there are people who go to the springs and make offerings for rain, but the springs that they've gone to all of their lives to make offerings don't flow anymore. So they're kind of at a loss of what to do.
There are communities now in the U.S., Native communities, looking 100, 200, 300 miles south of them to see what plants are similar to the plants that are thriving today, because those plants may no longer thrive on their reservations tomorrow. And they're looking to see what relatives they may be able to move, may be able to assist from other places, other ecozones, and bring them to there and work with nature, work with the resilience that nature has in terms of that. Organized governments and NGOs, indigenous or not, need to be open to those kinds of adaptations and mitigation measures that can increase the biodiversity and healing that web of life that is being torn asunder by the climate changes and the impacts that we're seeing.
If we don't follow these protocols, the seasonal calendar, which we have designed, it'll affect us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And today, going back on country is part of our beginning. It is healing for us. We are the young generations going back on country and taking up our obligation, our rights, our interests of development.
Communities say that recognition of land and resource rights is essential in building adaptive capacity and strengthening a community's climate resilience. Further, to fortify this resilience, communities are proactively developing their knowledge through respectful exchanges with scientists. For example, at a climate mitigation conference, Jeremy Russell Smith showed how traditional fire management practices were scientifically enhanced to enable traditional owners to continue caring for their lands, while at the same time reducing wildfire greenhouse gas emissions.
There's been a radical shift in the way we think about how the north of Australia should be managed with fire, that there's a far greater acceptance that customary management is appropriate and needs to be encouraged. And if you look at this Western Arnhem Land fire project, you'd have to say it has been successful in so many ways, and largely because right from the outset it had the full authority of the cultural governance arrangement. The senior traditional owners were very supportive of the needing to actually get together a program which would be inclusive, representative of their cultural needs, but knowing that it had to become sustainable in the longer term.
Scientists from Venezuela were also seeing the interregional potential of fire abatement.
La experiencia que tienen acá en Australia es abarcan un territorio mayor, pero es también impresionante cómo los mecanismos tradicionales de manejo de fuego son idénticos entre las comunidades aborígenes australianas y los amerindios, que estamos tan lejos en dos continentes tan diferentes y sin embargo es la misma forma de manejo.
There were some UN conference delegates that expressed concern about the history of scientific engagement with local communities.
Many technology or innovation that have been introduced, they have left people worse off, all in the name of science. Things were introduced, for example, mechanization introduced in Africa, knowing fully well that the topsoil is not that heavy to bear all those equipment, then we are worse off for it. And it is always better that if we come the participatory or the bottom-up approach, looking at what people are already doing, what is the impact of that, and why are they still keeping to it, and why has it been able to sustain them over the years, even before the advent of science or the introduction of science on that particular issue.
In Mexico, Fernando Briones, who works with Chiapas farming communities, explores the potential regional climate knowledge exchanges.
There's not a lot of interaction between science and scientific models and traditional knowledge of climate, but there's a huge potential over there because if rainy patterns are changing and the farmers may have the information, they may choose a better time to plant. So definitely we need to develop early warning systems.
Innovative climate adaptations in the Arctic include local to global environmental monitoring projects developing between reindeer herders and NASA.
It's a real pleasure to interact with the reindeer herders because they contribute so much information about what's going on the ground. One of our NASA projects is to try to use microwave radiometry to perhaps detect rain on snow. And in fact, we found that the indigenous knowledge, that is the reindeer herders on the ground, were able to identify in our satellite imagery those areas where indeed it had rained.
A key threat to herders, rains that freeze on snow, form a strong ice layer across the ground, sometimes causing starvation amongst the reindeer.
And it might serve as an early warning device for the reindeer herders so that they don't take the herds in that major area where there's a strong ice layer.
We established few resource information centers in the reindeer herding regions, and it means that these reindeer herding regions, they now participating in the kind of big network. Knowledge development is most important in face of climate change.
The Arctic Inupiaq people are also working collaboratively with scientists.
They go out on the field together, and indigenous people become not only the guide for the scientists, but they also become mentors for the scientists and teach them how to navigate on the sea ice, how to interpret animal behaviors, and many other environmental features that exist on the northern land.
In the face of increasing climate instability, the recognition of indigenous rights and respectful two-way knowledge collaborations are contributing to building better early warning systems and supporting local efforts towards climate resilience.